So Joe Biden's election as President of the United States in 2020 was regarded by many people as being historic. The front pages of the newspapers really bore that out. What was interesting to me, though, was the thought that we seem, certainly if we believe the newspapers, to be living in quite historic times. We're really being spoiled. If you cast your mind back 4 years to 2016, you might recall that Donald Trump's election was also described as being very historic, something that the newspapers bore out at that time as well. If you go back 4 years before that to Barack Obama's re-election in 2012, however, you'd assume that that was the last normal election that we've had. I mean, he was a popular guy, his approval ratings were great, he was the incumbent and he won a second term. There's nothing too out of the ordinary about that. And yet, looking at the newspapers, we can see that this was also described as being an historic election. Go back 4 years before that to Barack Obama's initial election, and this is something I think we can all agree is pretty historic. And yes, the newspapers also agreed. But by now, you should also be starting to ask the same question that I asked myself. Are we living in especially historic times? We actually have to go back as far as George W. Bush's re-election in 2004 to find the most recent presidential election that was not described as being historic. Of course, go back one further and we return to historic territory. Bush versus Gore in 2000 saw disputed ballots, allegations of dead people voting, court case after court case, attempts to stop the counting, and wait, isn't that what just happened in 2020? I mean, how historic can it be if it all happened again just 20 years later? Okay, so how about the fact that Bush versus Gore saw the winner of the popular vote lose in the Electoral College? Maybe that's the special thing? Well, that also happened in 2016, so again, not that historic. In fact, the presidential election has been won by the loser of the popular vote on 5 occasions now from a total of 59 elections to date. This means that the scenario happens just under 1 in every 10 elections, so it's not that rare, and it's not that historic. Okay then, so how about the fact that the winner of the 2000 election had to decide how to respond to 9/11? Well, that's probably a good point, so perhaps 2000 was certifiably historic. So if that is a legitimate reason for a presidential election being called historic, then what were the reasons for the previous ones? Well, 2008 was the election of the first African-American president? Sure. 2012 was the first re-election of an African-American president. I mean, that feels like it's more a direct consequence of the first election rather than being a historic election in and of itself. 2016, as we may recall, marked the first time that somebody with no prior political or military leadership experience won the presidency. That last part, the bit about military experience, is important, because if we only focus on political experience, then Trump was only the second such person after General Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected in 1952. And that's part of the problem. It's usually possible to move the goalposts and redefine filters to make anything historic if you want it to be. So could this be the reason why we live in such historic times? Is this simply an over-exaggeration on the part of the media in an era of internet news to get more clicks and likes by using unnecessary hyperbole? Probably. But it's probably also brought on by humans tending to assume that the times that they live in are truly unique, times that will never be forgotten. It's easy to do that with a never-ending stream of news and a feeling that the world around you is burning. But after a period of cooling off, it's remarkable how many of these unprecedented moments we live through are just not as big of a deal as we thought. And that brings us to the crux of the issue. In order for something to be truly historic, it needs to be viewed from the future. The event itself needs to have receded from memory and into history in order for us to view its importance and significance with true and rational objectivity. In short, it needs to be far away from us in the present in order for us to know how big it was. A simple test of this is, do we even remember it? Did it change anything, and has something else extremely similar happened since then? Can we predict what might become historic in the future? Well, it's not as easy as we might think. It's probably fair to say that most people who witnessed the 9/11 attacks had a feeling that this was going to go down in history, but we may have also thought that about the Edward Snowden revelations. Admittedly, it was not as big as the collapse of the World Trade Center, but at the time, the exposure of mass government surveillance of people's personal phone calls, texts, and social media posts really felt like it was going to be a turning point in people's data and privacy. And then, well, pretty much nothing happened. Both people and government are acting much the same as they did before. If anything, people are giving away more data than they ever have. The historic turning point, at least for now, appears not to have interrupted the flow of history at all. So what were the reasons that the media gave for 2020 being such a historic election? Well, one of the first given was that Trump failed to win re-election. This is a big deal, certainly, as presidents tend to win re-election more often than not. It's not hard to see why. They have huge fundraising potential since they're the sitting president of the United States. This also brings enormous amounts of press attention, so free media. Voters in America don't like to change horse midstream, as Abraham Lincoln famously said. There's a better the devil you know mentality that kicks in as well. I mean, you know what this guy will do when he's president because you've been watching him do it for 4 years. All the other guy can tell you is what he's planning to do, and you have no way to know if he's telling the truth. So is this rare? Well, the last time a president ran for re-election and lost was George H.W. Bush in 1992. That's a long time ago, in politics at least. But taking all numbers into account, we can see that, including Trump, 11 presidents have failed to win re-election from a total of 32 that have tried. In short, about 1/3 of all re-election attempts fail. I'd argue that this is not that rare, and it's not that historic. Another point that was made was that Joe Biden was the oldest person to ever assume the presidency. This is true, and by quite a long way. Biden was 78 years old when he took the oath of office, beating out the previous oldest who was, well, Donald Trump, 70 years old when he stood on the steps of the Capitol for the first time. In fact, even in real terms, Biden is old. He was born before the previous 4 presidents, Trump, Obama, Bush Jr., and Clinton. So it's definitely a unique point, but that doesn't necessarily make it historic. Will people in the future look back at this moment and remember this fact? Of course, we cannot say for certain, but it seems unlikely. Prior to Trump, the oldest person to assume the presidency was Ronald Reagan in 1980, and apart from the occasional joke cracked by Reagan himself, it was an issue rarely brought up in conversation prior to him losing that record in 2016. One other option for this being a historic election could be the prevalence of postal voting. 65.6 million presidential votes were cast in the 2020 presidential election. That is by far the largest amount of postal votes ever cast in US presidential election history. It's nearly double the number in the 2016 election. But once again, we run into significant issues. Did anyone change their vote because of the availability of postal voting? Probably not. Did it affect the result in any way? Probably not. Will this be the beginning of a trend of people voting by mail? Well, maybe. But we won't know that for a decade or so. So once again, we find an interesting factoid, an interesting statistic, but not necessarily something historic. So let's get to the big one, Kamala Harris. Harris is where the true potential for historicity might come in. She sits at the intersection of 3 traditionally marginalized groups in American politics: women, African Americans, and South Asians. When she was nominated, she was only the 3rd woman in history to run for vice president. 3rd is not first, though, so it was perhaps not that impressive until she actually won. So first sitting female vice president. Not bad. The African American part is a harder case, though. Does her victory into the vice presidency, a traditionally weak office, not get overshadowed by Barack Obama's election to the, actual presidency? Probably, although one feels that the gender makes a difference to any conclusion one might make on the topic. As for the South Asian side, well, this is truly unique. No American of South Asian background has gotten anywhere near the highest office in America. If you cast your memory back, you may remember Bobby Jindal in the 2016 primary season, but you also may not. So while each of these specific elements makes for interesting data, it may be the combination of the 3 that makes Kamala Harris's ascent to the vice presidency truly unique. But again, unique is not necessarily historic. It's also perhaps not a likely combination. In order for this to be historic, it really needs to be seen from the future as the start of a major change. Will that change be a surge in women, African Americans, or South Asian Americans running for and winning office? Could she run for the presidency herself one day, which would make 2016 the historical prelude to a truly historic moment, kind of history by association? I said at the beginning that the definition of something being historic or not depends on a simple test which asks 3 questions. Do we even remember it? Did it change anything? And has something else extremely similar happened since then? And the answer to all of these things, certainly in the case of Kamala Harris and the entire 2020 presidential election, is we don't know. And that's exactly the point. We won't know. Not until the present becomes history. As the playwright Alan Bennett writes in his work The History Boys, our perspective on the past alters. Looking back, immediately in front of us is dead ground. We don't see it, and because we don't see it, this means that there is no period so remote as the recent past. And one of a historian's jobs is to anticipate what our perspective of that period will be. So as historians, as history buffs, or just fans of history, what do you think our perspective of the 2020 election will be? Thanks for watching.